been wondering how to get certain resources in Dune Awakening, don't worry, there are quite a lot of them. In today's video, we're going to be discussing how you can get every single resource in the entire game. I'm going to make this easy. I'm going to start with the more simpler ones and work my way to the more advanced ones. I'll leave timestamps as well so you can find exactly what resource you're looking for, because there's quite a few of them. So let's discuss where you can find each individual one. Now, obviously, some of these resources are going to be found in multiple places, but I'm going to show you the best place to get them and also the best ways you can farm them while I go over each one. Starting at the most basic one, plant fiber, you can pretty much find this one everywhere. I'm not really going to go into too much detail. They're just going to see these pretty much in every region on the map. So you shouldn't have a hard time finding that one. Another one that's very easy to find that you'll find right away off the bat is going to be granite. Now, granite you can find in just about every single region. It's going to be most commonly found in the Hagga Basin south, the kind of spawn area, but you can find in pretty much every region as well. So it shouldn't be too difficult for you to find that one. The next one that you can be able to find in also just about everywhere is going to be copper. This one you can see quite easily by the fact that it has like the blue color to the rocks. So this one is going to be in pretty much every region. You shouldn't have a difficult time finding that at all. Another resource you can find just about everywhere. It's only going to be found in the caves. And you can see on the map, you'll see this cave icon. They're going to be in pretty much every region as well. And this is going to be the EMF generators. Now, you're going to need this one not only for the beginning of the game, but you're also going to need this in a lot of end game crafting recipes. So make sure you are actively going to these caves and picking up these EMF generators when you can find them, because they're actually going to be a very valuable resource, which you're going to need a lot, especially in the early and late game. Definitely very valuable. You're also going to find micro sandwich fibers in these caves. You're going to be able to use them to craft healing kits later on. So you might want to pick up a couple of those because healing is going to end up requiring quite a lot of resources later on. Now, another resource which you're probably going to utilize, especially in the early and also late stage of the game, a Plasteel Microflora fiber, as well as mechanical parts. These two I've kind of grouped together because you can be able to find them together, and this is going to be in these kind of like down starship wrecks. Now, there are going to be two types of shipwrecks you're going to be able to notice. You're going to be the smaller ones, you're going to get the big ones, which are going to be like these big starships. In the bigger ones, which you will see throughout all the regions of the map, you will find these resources inside the chest in these starships. So make sure you do end up popping in every now and then if you are low on these resources. They're not too difficult, they're not too demanding either, so just make sure you pick up those once in a while. Another very important resource, especially when it comes to building vehicles, as well as a couple of other things, is going to be armor plating. Now, armor plating you'll be able to find on the heavy enemies. When you do end up defeating heavy enemies, you're going to notice there's going to be armor plating on their bodies quite often. The number can vary, sometimes it's one, sometimes it's like several, so make sure you do end up consistently looting these, because you're going to really need this, especially when it comes to late game vehicle crafting. You're going to wish you were collecting these in the early game, because this is going to be a very important resource later on. You're also going to find these in enemy lockers, and enemy lockers can be found in quite a few locations. Outposts sometimes have them. Testing facilities do typically have a couple of lockers in them, so just make sure you're constantly looting these lockers and taking those armor plating. Don't be like me that end up ignoring these quite often, and then when it came to the late game, I was wishing that I kept more of these armor plating, because you actually need them quite a bit. Just make sure you're constantly on the lookout for those. Another resource which can be quite important is going to be Holtzman Actuators. Now, Holtzman Actuators are going to be found, a very easy way to find them. You're going to see typically around the maps, you're going to see like these downed ornithopters or these destroyed ornithopters. If you do end up kind of taking a cut array and mining them, just like any other resource node, you will be provided with Holtzman Actuators. You can also find them in crashed ships, not the big ones, the smaller ones do end up typically having a Holtzman Actuators, but you probably will find these in quite abundance in other locations too, but the most reliable ways are going to be, like I said, find those downed ornithopters. You can find them in quite a few areas. If you do end up mining them, you will be getting some Holtzman Actuators. Another couple of other resources you should be able to find quite easily is going to be the gun parts as well as the blade parts. Now, you're going to have to find these on pretty much most enemies. The enemies that obviously use blades are going to drop blade parts. The enemies that use guns are going to drop gun parts. And you're going to need this for quite a few crafting recipes when it comes to building your own weapons and blades. So just make sure you keep looting those when you do end up needing to craft some new weapons. There's going to be another resource as well called Agave seeds. Now, these aren't going to be needed for that many things other than mostly cosmetic things, but you will be able to find these in the region of the Odam region. And this you will see on the map. There'll be kind of like these little icons, these like little shrub-like icons. There are a couple of locations that do have them. The Odam region is pretty much the only place where I can find the Agave seeds. Just make sure you end up coming here if you do end up needing those. Now, the other resource which you probably end up noticing is going to be called spice infused. Insert name afterwards. There's going to be either a spice infused iron, spice infused aluminium, spice infused plasteel, spice infused duraluminum. You're going to typically find these inside of like enemy outposts, or sometimes you're able to find them in imperial testing facilities. The deeper you go in, you'll notice typically there's going to be a very big spherical looking chest. It's going to be a much bigger chest. It's going to be kind of like the biggest loot box, so to speak, in the entire game. And these loot boxes are going to be awarding you with the spice infused resource. Now, these are used for crafting unique items. So when you do end up finding blueprints that are going to give you schematics for more rarer items, you're typically going to need to find some of these spice infused resources in order to craft them. And they are going to be able to be found behind these like keycard walls that are going to be typically found in enemy outposts or testing facilities. Depending on how far in the game you are, obviously if you're the early stage, you'll get more of the spice infused, more basic resource like iron. But if you're more late in the game, you'll start finding things like spice infused dura aluminium or spice infused aluminium, or if you're in the deep desert, even spice infused plastanium, which you will then be able to get some of these spice infused items from it. You're not going to be able to find that much of it. It's a very uncommon resource, but at the same time, it's also not used for that many things, so you don't need big quantities of it as well, so don't worry too much about that. Another resource which is going to be similar to this is going to be the advanced servoks and the particle capacitors. These two resources, especially the particle capacitors, are going to be utilized in a lot of crafting recipes, especially when it comes to vehicles. And these are going to be found in Imperial testing facilities. They're going to be Imperial testing facilities in all the regions, and they're all going to have this resource. So it doesn't really matter too much on which one you do. Some are going to give obviously a bit more than others, depending how big the facility is and depending how many chests you're going to find in them. You should be able to at least pick up 30 to maybe 60 of these resources on each of these facilities that you end up visiting. There's also going to be metal scraps or scrap metal, which you can be able to find also pretty much lying around everywhere. You'll see this by kind of just, you can pick them up off the floor directly, or you will see kind of like broken crates or like these blackened, charred looking metal structures, which you should be able to use a cutter ray to harvest. And this will give you a bit of scrap metal, which you will utilize in quite a few things throughout the game, but they are very abundant and very easy to find. So you shouldn't worry too much about that. Then another resource that you're also going to make use of, especially when it comes to generators and fueling generators, is going to be the fuel cells. Now, the fuel cells are luckily very easy to find. Once again, also pretty much found in every single region. You can find these in also a lot of facilities. You can find them in outposts, but the easiest way to find them is going to be like these big battery packs you're going to see on the ground. They're kind of like this white cubicle shape. And you can also use a cutter ray to harvest them. And this is going to provide you with a lot of fuel cells. So you're going to be needing them, especially when it comes to fueling generators and anything that requires fuel in the late game and early game, of course, as well. Then you're going to be able to move on at a certain point in the game. You're going to expand to go to the Vermilius Gap. There's Eastern Vermilius Gap and Western Vermilius Gap. You'll notice this by the kind of like orangey sand color that you'll see in this region. And this region is going to obviously open up a whole bunch of new resources as well. And there's some of the resources you're going to notice here is you're also going to be able to start finding iron. Now, iron is going to be able to be utilized for a couple of things, especially when it comes to steel later on. But for now, it's going to look very similar to the copper blocks, but instead of like blue color on the node, you're going to see a silvery color on the nodes. And this is going to provide you with iron. You'll also notice in the Vermilius Gap, you will see some facilities. There'll be like these giant refineries. They'll be called the ironworks. You'll typically be able to find them on some of these kind of rock formation islands. There'll be these tall structures with kind of like chimneys that extend into the sky. And if you do end up going through these facilities, there'll be a lot of machineries inside of them. And if you open these machineries, you'll be able to find complex machinery parts. And these are going to be utilized for quite a few crafting things as well. Pretty much every crafting recipe you're going to find in this guide is going to be having uses for something. You're definitely going to want to make sure that you're picking up these resources when you find them, because you might not need them right now, but you definitely will need them at certain points in the game. So just make sure you keep your eye out for those. Now, once you make it to this part of the game, you're probably going to start needing silicon for a couple of things. And to get silicon, you're going to need to look for flour sand. Now, you'll notice flour sand is going to be this kind of like whitish color sand. You will see these little kind of spots of sand that looks a bit whiter. And this is going to allow you to get silicon by harvesting the sand. Now, to harvest the sand, you're going to need a compactor. And if you shoot a compactor at the sand, it will then kind of gather it together in little clumps, and you can gather it, and then you can take it to a chemistry station and turn it into silicon blocks, which you're going to need for quite a few crafting recipes. Some of these flour sand blocks are going to be very awkward spots. They're going to be in the middle of open sand, which is going to make you very vulnerable to the sandworm. But some of them are very close to kind of like little rocky islands. Some of them are actually in spots where it's actually completely safe, or at least certain zones of this flour sand is completely safe, where you can harvest them without the fear of sandworms. So just look for the best spots in order to harvest these. You can find them in pretty much every region, but you're probably going to first start gathering it when you get to the Vermilius Gap. Now, once you progress further in the game, you're probably going to need to start expanding, and you're going to need to start making use of steel. Now, to get steel, you're going to need to get iron, which you can find in Vermilius Gap. You're going to need another component called carbon ore, and this you can be able to find in the Hagga Rift location. It's going to be on the far right side of the map, and this is going to be where you're going to be able to find carbon ore. It is going to have like a whitish color to the nodes. You're going to see like kind of like a crystal formation kind of sticking out of these nodes, and that is going to be carbon ore. You need to combine this with iron, and this is going to then be turned into steel. So just head on over to the Hagga Rift. You might want to take a buggy or something there, because you're going to be able to have to lug a lot of these across in order to be able to build a decent amount of steel, but you're going to find these in the Hagga Rift location. Then another very important resource, which you're going to be able to find in the same region. This is going to be found in this kind of like deep chasm or crack. This is going to be Erythrite Crystal, and you're going to be able to notice these by these kind of like very bright pinkish purpley color crystals, which you're going to be seeing growing on the walls crystals in this crack region. Now, you are going to find more of them when you do end up going into the kind of like side paths, which will lead you into like enemy facilities, which is a little bit more difficult, but you will find more of them inside. You don't really need that many of these crystals to get a decent amount of cobalt paste, so you will definitely pick up at least several, if not maybe 20 on your trip down to this chasm. If I were you though, I would make sure you take a buggy with you since you're able to gather a lot more and bring a lot more back to your base, since it is a bit of a trek to go all the way down here to gather these crystals each time. Now, another resource which you're going to be able to only find pretty much in this chasm, or at least one of the more reliable places to find it in this chasm, is going to be ray amplifiers. And this is going to be found in enemy camps. You're going to find this typically in the Chom mineral extraction facilities. These are going to be kind of like enemy outposts, which will have these ray amplifiers in their chests. So just make sure you stop by these, loot them, and you should be able to pick up a couple of ray amplifiers. You don't need it for that many crafting recipes, so it's not super important you get large amounts of these, but you will be able to find it within these facilities around here. Then another resource which is going to be in a similar region. If you just go a little bit more right than the Hagga Rift, you will notice a region called the Jabal Ifrit al-Sharq. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that one correctly. I hope I am. But you will end up finding these enemy outposts over here, and these enemy outposts will contain something called Calibrated Servok. And if you do end up opening the chest in these outposts, you will find quite an abundance of these Calibrated Servoks, and they're going to be used in quite a lot of machinery in the late game. You definitely want to come visit here a couple of times to stock up on these Calibrated Servoks, as they are going to be needed, especially when it comes to like power generators and whatnot. Now moving on to actually a very important resource, one that you're probably going to be farming all the way into the late game quite a bit of, and that's going to be aluminium. Now aluminium is going to be a fairly heavy mineral, so it's definitely advised to bring a buggy if you want to farm large quantities of this, but you're going to find this in the eastern shield wall, and that is going to be at the northern top part of the map. There's also going to be two main shield walls. It's going to be eastern shield wall and western shield wall. You're going to be able to find aluminium in both these locations, and this is going to be a resource which you are going to need, like I said, quite a bit of, so make sure you do end up harvesting that. It's kind of like a rock that looks quite similar to gravel, a little bit more smooth and flattened. You're going to need to start getting more advanced cut arrays though when you get to this stage, since these rocks are going to require you to have, I believe it is a tier 4 cut array in order to harvest these. Now you're going to find also another resource. You can see these blackened rocks. It's going to be called Basalt. You're going to need these in order to create Plasteel, which is going to be required in order to build some of the nicer looking structures. If you have like maybe something like an Atreides structure base, or maybe a Harkonnen base structures, you're going to need this Plasteel in order to craft that. So make sure that you do end up collecting that if you do want to end up building a nice looking base, but you're able to find that in the same region, the same locations that you do end up finding aluminium. Now at this stage in the game, you might start requiring other resources such as heavy calibrated compressors and light calibrated compressors. You'll be able to find these in enemy outposts in this same area. This is going to be where you find aluminium. So eastern and western shield wall, the enemy outposts here are going to come with heavy calibrated compressors and light calibrated compressors when you do end up looting their chests. So just make sure you end up popping here if you do need some of those compressors. Likewise, also going to be another very important resource which you're going to need a lot of in the late game. Also going to be required in quite a few different things such as vehicles as well as machinery, and that's going to be industrial pumps. Now industrial pumps you can find other locations too, but the most consistent place I was able to find it is in this place called Sentinel City. Now Sentinel City is going to be found by this kind of like spire or very tall rock formation you're going to find in the center of eastern shield wall. It's going to be like a very big enemy facility, and this is going to come with some fairly high level enemies, so make sure you are prepared for this. Now you can do this without actually fighting enemies. If you are in maybe an earlier stage of the game and you're not quite ready to fight them, you can kind of put your shields on and just run through this facility, ransack as many chests as you can, then run out. It is a little bit dangerous, but you should be able to get by, at least I did in the beginning, without actually fighting these enemies, because they can be a little bit difficult to defeat if you're not well prepared, but you can get some of these industrial pumps. You probably don't need that many of them, at least starting out. Now moving on a little bit west to the eastern shield wall, you're going to see this location called the Misa Terril. Now the Misa Terril is going to be a very important location because it is pretty much the only place that I can see in order to get something called Diamondine dust as well as Carbide scraps. Now why these two resources are important is because when it comes to vehicles, the flying vehicles particularly, they are going to require you to get Diamondine dust and Carbide scraps. Now this location is going to come with some fairly high level enemies, at least in the early game it's going to be considered fairly high level, and they can be a bit challenging in order to defeat. But once again, similar to the Sentinel City, you can loot a lot of these chests without fighting enemies. You can try either sneak around them, or you can just try put your shields on, sprint, take everything you can in the chest, run through the enemies, and then get out. Just be prepared though, you might end up dying 1 or 2 times if you do it this way, since they are going to be quite high level. If you are in the early stage of the game, they're going to hit pretty hard, so just make sure you are aware of that. There are a couple of chests in certain locations. You're going to see just in the entrance there where you gather the kind of key card in order to open up the main facility. There are going to be 2 chests here with some of these resources. There's also going to be some on the left and right side up these side paths where you will be able to find some of this diamondine dust as well as these carbide scraps. And then if you go head on over to the main facility, there will be a door you can open with a cut array. This will give you another key card where you can open up another bigger door, and this will then provide you with a larger amount of diamondine dust as well as some carbide scraps. There's also a couple of other locations around here. There's some enemy camps on the outside of this mesoterial which will also have it, but it's just much easier to do it. Go straight into the mesoterial. You can't miss it. It's got a giant electrified sandworm there which is dead, and that will give you a very clear indication that you are in the right place. Now this area is also going to provide a couple of other valuable things. You're going to be able to find Santrout leathers and Stillsuit tubing, and this will be found on the enemy's dead bodies. You will need these materials when it comes to certain armors. You can craft them using this. You will find these in not just mesoterial, but pretty much in all the enemies that you're going to find in this region, the Odam region. You're going to end up finding these kind of like very cultisty, high-tech spec ops kind of looking enemies, and they will carry with them this Santrout leathers as well as Stillsuit tubing. You also notice there's certain locations here. You will see these locations like Stone Step Village as well as Kind's Promise. You also see Mandek Shithole. Yes, that is its actual name. And you will be able to find insulated fabrics in this area, which is going to be needed for certain things when it comes to armors and fabrics. So make sure you do end up coming to these facilities if you do end up needing those. Now moving on to one of the more dangerous regions in at least Hagga Basin, the Sheol region, there is going to be a couple of things that are going to be very valuable here. If you do end up looking just outside the reactive zone, it's probably worth mentioning a lot of this region is going to be radioactive. So make sure you bring a radiation suit if you come down here. Otherwise, you're going to die very, very quickly. There are different tiers of radiation suits. They are going to have very small increments in terms of their value, but you are going to want to come here with a radiation suit. This one, however, the Edge of Acheron, this one is actually not going to be radiated, and you're going to need to come here if you want to find military power regulators and hydraulic pistons. Now, this is going to be an enemy camp. It's going to be just outside the radiation zone, so you don't need a radiation suit. However, the enemies here are going to be some of the highest level enemies you're going to be able to find in the at least starting area, Hagga Basin. So you're going to want to come here with fairly late game gear, since these enemies are going to be quite dangerous. Once again, you could potentially try to do this by just running through the chest, taking as what you can without fighting them. But at this point, it's going to be quite difficult to do it that way, since these enemies are going to be a lot more dangerous. But again, you don't need a radiation suit if you want to get this, but you are going to need to still deal with some fairly high level enemies if you want to get this. These resources are going to be needed to build a lot of the late game vehicles, particularly the flying vehicles. You're definitely going to want to come here when it comes to building, I believe it's the Mark 5 ornithopters and above are going to need some of these resources. So just make sure that you do end up visiting this location when you're starting to build those higher tier vehicles. Then the shipwrecks are also going to come with some higher tier loot here. You're going to notice that there are going to be a couple of shipwrecks in this radioactive region. You're going to need to make sure you come with a radiation suit, but some of these shipwrecks are going to come with irradiated slag, and you're going to need that for a couple of end game crafting recipes. You don't really need it that much in the early game, but especially when it comes to the late game, these are going to have some uses. So if you need irradiated slag, you're going to be able to find it in these crash facilities. A couple of other places you can also find it. You can also find this quite a bit in the deep desert. It's just much easier to find it here in the Sheol region, since it is in Hagga Basin, so you don't have to worry about PvP, and it's a lot safer to do it here, relatively speaking at least. Then in the Sheol region, there's also going to be another resource which you're pretty much only going to be able to find here, and that's going to be the Jasmium Crystals. Now, the Jasmium Crystals are going to be needed in order to make Dura-Aluminium, and Dura-Aluminium is going to be a resource that you're going to need quite a bit of, especially in the late game. If you do want to find it, you're going to need to combine it with aluminium, and together this will give you Dura-Aluminium. Now, in order to do this, you're going to have to once again come here with, I would recommend only come here with an ornithopter. It's very dangerous to do this with a ground vehicle, since you're going to have to kind of make these return trips back and forth to try reset your radioactive counter, because even with the radiation suit, you're going to take radioactive damage. So you're going to want to make sure that you do end up kind of coming in, gathering a bit of these crystals, going out, letting the radiation dissipate, and then going back in again, since it is going to be kind of like a back and forth to gather these resources. Now, you will notice that there will be these kind of like pools of toxic sludge or radioactive sludge. These crystals are pretty much found in these. They're going to be having these kind of like bluish colors. They're going to have like a very distorted, very unique shape. You can't really miss them. They're going to be found, like I said, in these kind of pools of radioactive sludge. So you're going to have to kind of get down and dirty, get into these pools of radioactive sludge, and then you're going to be able to mine these and get these crystals. But again, you're going to want to come here with a flying vehicle, since this region is fairly dangerous because of the radiation. Now, it's also going to be another resource which you're able to find a little bit of it in the Hagga Basin, and that is going to be spice sand. Now, spice sand is going to be one of the most valuable resources, if not the most valuable resource in the entire game, but you're only going to find very small quantities of it in Hagga Basin. The rest of it you'll be able to find in much larger quantities in the deep desert, which is going to be kind of the next location you're going to go to in order to start gathering the more in-game resources. Now, to get to the deep desert, you're going to have to end up going into a ornithopter, and you're going to want to fly to the edges of the map. When you do end up flying to any of the outskirts of the barriers around the Hagga Basin region, you will get given a prompt where you can fast travel, and this will take you to an overall world map. Now, once you see the overall world map, you'll be able to travel to the top left, and you'll see this big region called the Deep Desert. Now, how the Deep Desert works is whatever server you are on, it is part of a cluster. So you might be in a server like Glacier. There might be a whole bunch of little CHs, and those are basically servers. And they're all going to be connected to one big Deep Desert server. Deep Desert is going to be shared by all the servers on this cluster. Now, you can't leave beyond this cluster, so this cluster is going to be kind of like a group of settlements that's all going to be connected by the Deep Desert. And this Deep Desert region is going to be quite dangerous because the enemies here are going to be much harder than the Hagga Basin, and there's going to be a lot of PvP here, since like pretty much half the region is PvP. It is going to be dangerous since other players are going to be able to potentially be your enemies. And if they do end up shooting you and destroying your vehicles, well, that's not going to be very fun, so just make sure you are very prepared for that. Don't come here unless you're prepared. And also don't go too far into Deep Desert unless you're also prepared to deal with other hostile players who might try down you. Now, speaking of the Deep Desert, there's a couple of things you're going to be able to find here, which is going to be quite important. The first thing is going to be larger quantities of spice sand. Now, speaking of spice sand, we touched on it a little bit earlier. Spice sand is going to be this kind of like purpley substance you're going to see on sand. And this is going to be harvestable, which you're going to be able to then take to a refinery later on and then turn this into spice melange, which is going to be needed pretty much for every endgame crafting recipe. You're going to need spice. So you're going to have to come with a lot of trips here and gather. If you want to find out more about spice sand, if you want to figure out how to deal with this resource a bit better, I will leave a link in my description below discussing everything you need to know about spice and how to gather the most of it. I'm not going to get into too much detail. Just know that you're going to find bigger quantities of this in the Deep Desert, but it's going to be more dangerous to get it here. Another resource which is going to be very important to gather, this you can also find in the PvE zone, but it's going to be more abundant in the PvP zone, since the deeper you go into the Deep Desert, the more abundant these rare resources become, and also the more dangerous it becomes, because as you go further into the Deep Desert, it becomes PvP. So keep that in mind. But you're going to be able to find these resources, these like mineral nodes. You're going to see titanium. It's going to be like this bluish rock, very distinct, got very like nice colors to it. Also has like a very unique structure with a lot of reflections. This is going to end up giving you titanium. You get to find these in abundance the deeper you go into the Deep Desert. There are some islands that you get to find in the Deep Desert that are going to be exclusively titanium, but those are going to be all the way out in the H and I zone. So it's going to be quite deep in the Deep Desert to find these. You're also going to end up finding another resource called Stravidium, which is going to be kind of like a different type of resource. It's going to have like the silvery color. It's going to be very like dome-like shaped with like a lot of like little strands. You should be able to very distinctly identify it. And this is also going to be a very important resource. Similar to titanium, there's also going to be islands you're going to find that are going to be just pretty much only Stravidium, but it's going to be deep in the Deep Desert. If you're in the more shallow regions that are PvE zones, it's going to be a bit rarer to find these, but you should still be able to find smaller quantities of this. You're going to be able to use the Stravidium to make Stravidium fiber, which you're going to be able to get at a chemistry station, and then you're going to use the Stravidium fiber plus titanium in order to make plastonium. Now, plastonium is going to be another very important resource, which you're going to need in pretty much every endgame crafting recipe, whether it be for weapons, armor, vehicles, structures. Pretty much everything late game is also going to require plastonium, so make sure you do end up visiting this region. When you do end up getting to the late game crafting recipes, since you are going to need this, it's only going to be able to be found in the Deep Desert. Now, the Deep Desert also has a couple of other very valuable resources which you are going to need. One of them is going to be Thermoelectric Coolers. Now, Thermoelectric Coolers are going to be required when it comes to building some of the more advanced like things like the cut arrays, as well as the compactors. You can be able to find these in the Imperial testing facilities, as well as the big down starships in the Deep Desert. But it's also important to note, don't go off into the actual Deep Desert where you see all the sand dunes. If you stay in the like entrance region where you see like the kind of mountain range, this area is pretty much mostly PvE, so you should be safe from other players, and there are going to be more easier testing facilities here which won't have the high level enemies you'll see in the actual Deep Desert where the dunes are, and you'll still be able to get some of these thermoelectric coolers from here. So if you are like just dipping your toe into the Deep Desert and you just want to get this resource, stay within the mountain range area. You will be able to find these in these either testing facilities or down starships. You can find these thermoelectric coolers quite abundantly, actually. You don't really need that many of them, so it should be pretty easy to find. Now, the rest of the resources I'm going to list here are going to be quite interesting in order to obtain them. Now, these resources are going to require you to go actually deep into the Deep Desert. These ones are going to be a little bit annoying to get because they're not going to be very consistent. You're either going to get these in one of three ways. Typically, you're going to be able to find the smaller down ships, which are going to be scattered throughout the Deep Desert, and these are going to award you with quite a few of these resources. One of them is going to be plasteel plates. If you do end up looting some of these down ships, you will find plasteel plates, quite a few of them, and this resource is going to be quite important because it's going to allow you to basically think of it like a way to kind of like transform some of the more basic components, things like the armor plating, things like the power regulators, things like the calibrated compressors into the more advanced versions of themselves. But you're going to basically need plasteel plates in order to do that, plus the more earliest phases. You can actually find some of these more advanced resources outright in the deep desert, or you can craft them yourself, but you're going to need plasteel plates in order to do that. And plasteel plates, like I said, you can find them in the downed ships which are going to crash in the deep desert. So just make sure you do end up looting them. Be careful if you go deep into the deep desert where it becomes PvP zones, because other players might end up killing you if they see you on these downed ships. So just watch out for that. But otherwise, you will be able to get this quite an abundance when you do end up looting these down ships. Speaking of these down ships, you're going to find a couple of other very valuable resources, which you will find in quite a big abundance here. Things like Irradiated Slag, you'll be able to find. Things like Ballistic Fabric, you'll be able to find. Things like the Advanced Holtzman Actuators, you'll be able to find here. You also be able to find the Plasteel composite gun parts, which is similar to the gun parts, but it's used for the Plasteel tier of weaponry. You're also going to find the improved water tubes here. You're also going to be able to find advanced machinery throughout these ships, as well as Diamondine blade parts and Diamondine gun parts. Another resource you'll be able to find in these down ships is going to be irradiated core. And these irradiated cores, like I said, will be found in these down ships, either the larger ones or the smaller down ships throughout the deep desert, so not too difficult to find them either. Thermo-responsive ray amplifier will also be able to be found here, as well as the fuel-efficient industrial pump will be found in this manner as well. There's also going to be atmospheric filtered fabric, which you'll be able to find within these down ships on top of that. And you're also going to be able to find overclock power regulators, should also be able to be found in quite abundance on these down ships. There's also going to be the fluted light calibrated compressor, as well as the fluted heavy calibrated compressor. And then there's also going to be the precision rangefinder, which you want to find here. These items can be found either in the small ships, which are going to crash. There's also going to be big starships, which you're going to find crashed in the deep desert. You can also go into those, and they will typically end up finding you some of these resources, as well as the Imperial testing facilities in the deep desert. You should also be able to find quite a few of these resources in them. Now, all of these locations are obviously going to come with them quite a bit of risk, especially these PvE facilities with the AI, which are going to be significantly harder when it comes to deep desert. These things are going to be pretty much 10 times stronger than the most difficult enemies you'll face in Hagga Basin. So be very, very prepared. You're going to need to have a very high tier weapon in order to take on these enemies, but these locations are going to be where you find these components. Now, if you can't find these components because either you haven't been very lucky, because there's a certain amount of RNG to find these locations, you can always craft them yourself, and that's going to be where I said these plasteel plates are going to come from. You're typically going to need a couple of items in order to craft them, and they're typically going to come with the base version plus plasteel plates plus something else, whether it be spice melange or something else, will then give you the more advanced version, such as plasteel composite armor plating. For example, you're going to take armor plating plus plasteel plates plus spice melange will then transform into plasteel composite armor plating. You're going to find these crafting recipes at an advanced fabricator, and then there's also be things like, for example, the Improved Holtzman Actuator. That's going to require a Holtzman Actuator. It's going to require plasteel and cobalt paste, which will then give you an Improved Holtzman Actuator. Similar to this, like the precision rangefinder, you're going to need a rangefinder plus plasteel plates plus gun parts, and they'll give you the precision rangefinder. All these components are pretty much going to be needed when it comes to the Plastanium tier, or the Mark 6 version. The highest tier are going to require these resources, which you're going to be able to find pretty much only in the deep desert. Or again, you just need to get the plasteel plates, and if you have the plasteel plates, you can turn them into the higher tier versions from the more basic versions that you can find in Hagga Basin, so long as you have the plasteel plates. Now, the plasteel plates, again, you can find them in the deep desert. They're not that difficult to find, but then you have to obviously also use crafting components from other things in order to combine them together to find these resources. Now, you can also find these resources in a couple of other ways. You can end up potentially visiting the cities, either Arakeen or Harker Village, and you can go into the banking section when you find the bank, go to the shop, and you can see other players might be selling some of these resources. Maybe you don't feel like gathering plasteel armor plating. You can potentially buy them from other players. Obviously, they will come at a price. It's an open market. People can price them however they want. So it's a bit of a bidding system, but you might be able to find a good deal and buy some of these components without having to keep making trips to the deep desert. So if you really can't craft them, or you don't have the crafting recipes, you might be able to go to the shop and buy them there. So make sure you keep a lookout on those whenever you visit these places, since there is an open market for players to buy and sell things on as well. Another resource, which you're probably going to be wondering where you find it, is going to be the spice residue. Now, spice residue you'll be able to find pretty much as a byproduct when you do end up crafting spice melange, or when you do end up refining for spice melange. Every time you end up crafting or refining for spice melange, you will get like a byproduct which will also be produced, and that will be spice residue. It's very easy to obtain. As long as you're actively harvesting spice, you will get tons of this stuff, so don't worry too much about that. Very easy to get, and you shouldn't have a problem getting these. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below if there's any other resource locations that you maybe know about, a good way to get them. I'd love to find out if I maybe missed any, but otherwise this should tell you all the places you can get all the different resources from. Again, there are going to be other ways to get these resources. There are going to be shops in the various outposts where you could potentially buy these resources. I would avoid that if possible, since they are going to sell them at a very, very expensive rate. And you can typically find better deals if you go to the player market in either, Hagga Village, where you can potentially buy these at a much cheaper rate. So probably best to avoid buying them from the NPCs when possible, because they sell them at a very, very expensive rate, most of these components. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys again next time. Take care, everyone, and bye-bye.